So the number of workers on contracts are on the rise. 38% of workers in the education sector are on contracts. I think that statistic, I heard that and I thought, like, you're kidding, you know. So the people in the education sector, we're talking teachers, the people who are tertiary educated, and also the other workers in that sector, the education assistants, the admin support at schools and also in universities. It's a big issue as well. So look, I mean, I think looking at the education sector, like we've got a growing population here in WA, more kids that need to be educated. If anything, we're going to need more teachers and more education workers. Yet more and more people seem to be on contracts. A lot of teachers are on 12-month contracts, fixed-term contracts, so they'll end at the end of the school year, and again, you're in that situation where they don't have pay for that long summer break, and then they'll have to reapply and hope that they get a job at a school the next year. I've met, our union represents school officers in schools, and I've met people who are on in an even more precarious situation where they're on 3-month contracts, so it's a school term contract, and so they don't know whether they've got a job in 9 weeks' time or whatever, which is just outrageous. So, and it's just so that the government or the employer doesn't have to pay people for holidays. So look, I mean, that sort of brings me to one of the myths about insecure work, and something that we've been talking about a little bit at my workplace about, this myth that the public service is the last bastion of secure work. It's just not the case. I mean, like, as we can see from that example in education, a huge proportion of people on contract, and look, I've got some of my colleagues at the end of the table here who would be able to attest to the fact that workers in the public sector, you meet people all the time who are on contracts, people who are casual and part-time as well. But yeah, I was reading a report today actually released by the Public Sector Commission regarding the WA workforce, and the report noted that in 2010-11, permanent positions represented 47.5% of all advertised vacancies in the public service, compared with 51% for the 2009-10. And that corresponded with an increase in the amount of fixed-term contracts offered as well. So there's just a direct correlation there where there are more contracts advertised and less full-time permanent positions advertised. So look, casual and contract are just two forms of insecure work, but I'm sure the other panellists can talk about the other forms of insecure work. And yeah, look, I'll move on. In terms of why we're facing this situation, I think we need to sort of analyse that. I mean, I think this is part of the capitalist agenda to shift risk onto workers. So rather than, than business bearing the ups and downs of the business cycle, the capitalist cycle, what actually happens is that workers are bearing that cost. So when times are lean, the boss can just, get rid of you, and then, hire casuals and bolster the workforce with contracts and casuals and other forms of people who are on insecure work when times are good, but at the same time, workers actually don't get any share in those profits, a comparative share in those profits when times are good. So it really is about them shifting risk onto workers. Because they don't want to pay you sick leave and holiday leave, and they don't want to pay you superannuation and workers' comp and other entitlements. So if they can get out of doing that, they will. Insecure work also gives bosses way more power over their workforce. So workers in forms of insecure work are less likely to know their rights, and they're less likely to stand up for their rights. They're less likely to join the union. And as we can see, insecure work becoming more widespread, it's really part of this capitalist strategy to de-unionise, I think. In particular, in relation to the public sector, I think the issue of privatisation and outsourcing of public sector functions, that's also a real risk and a real deterioration of good, secure work. When you look at the public service, it's comparatively fairly well unionised compared to other industries. Good, fairly good wages and conditions. When public services are outsourced, they're outsourced to not-for-profit companies that are, less well unionised, worse pay, worse conditions, and same when functions are outsourced to for-profit companies like Serco and all of those other lovely companies out there. So look, I mean, it's a big risk at the moment with the Barnett government, that's our state government, really on this push to privatise government functions to not-for-profit organisations and also big multinational companies. I think the other reason why this has happened is that there's a real lack of regulation over insecure forms of work. So basically, casual work and contract work, employers just employ these people willy-nilly. It really should be. There should be a regulatory framework that says you can only employ casuals in this situation. You can only employ contracts to fill a vacancy when someone's on leave, or you can only employ a contract to carry out a specific project for a specific period of time. So I think government bears the responsibility for this problem, by not having that regulatory framework. But I do think the union movement does need to look at it as well and kind of go, all right, we haven't exactly policed things the way we probably should have either. So, but I do think that that the problem is with government. I think if we just look at the effects of insecure work on the worker, it's all the sort of things that we would expect. So, like I said, they're less likely to join the union, less confident in raising workplace issues, like health and safety, for instance. They're less aware of their rights. And personally for that worker, there's no steady or guaranteed income. There are fewer opportunities for training or advancement. It often leads to increased stress because they don't know when their next paycheck is or whether they'll be able to pay their mortgage. And poor work-life balance, all of those kind of things. And many forms of insecure work mean that there's no access to basic entitlements that the union movement has fought hard for. So paid sick leave, annual leave, long service leave. There's a whole section of our population that just does not get a look in on that stuff. I think we just have to also keep in mind that this doesn't affect all workers equally. I think women as a particular subset of the workforce are really affected by insecure work. There are more women in casual and contract and other forms of insecure work, and often it's because it's the only way that they can achieve flexibility to look after their kids and that kind of thing. So frequently they're taking poor jobs with low pay and low conditions so that they can achieve that flexibility. And in terms of the WA Public Service, it's comprised mostly of women. So that report I referred to before by the Public Sector Commission stated that 69.2% of the workforce WA Public Sector is women, and 30.8% is men. So and that's a significantly higher portion of women in the public sector compared to 45.5% of women in the Australian workforce as a total. So, and look, a smaller proportion of women than men hold permanent positions. So 68.7% of women hold permanent positions compared to 77.1% of men holding permanent positions in the public sector. So, female-dominated jobs tend to be jobs that are more insecure, lower pay, poorer conditions, and recalling that example of the education sector I talked about before, that's even true of skilled jobs, like people who go to university and get a teaching qualification. It doesn't guarantee you any form of security. So that's sort of effect on that sort of set of workers. In terms of the effect on families and communities, you see people struggling to repay loans and mortgages, or even to get a loan or a mortgage if you actually don't have a permanent job. It's quite difficult. Sometimes workers might have to take on an additional job to make up that income, less time with their family. They find it hard to plan from week to week. Sue told me about an example about a worker that couldn't had to pull their kids out of after-school activities because they couldn't budget for that week to week. So I mean, even kids are suffering, even in that sort of flows out into that's less participation in community sports and arts and other sort of things that we need in our community. And I'd also say political activism, less people are willing to actually get out there and think about bigger picture issues if they're worrying about day-to-day bread and butter issues. So, and then there's also the impact it has on I guess public money in terms of it's more people accessing welfare, reliance on welfare. And that's true when they retire as well. If you don't have a superannuation fund that's big enough to support you in retirement, then you rely on the government to pay your pension, and charities as well, reliance on charities. So all these kind of flow-on effects. In terms of what's to be done, like that's kind of the hard part that I don't really have an answer to exactly at the moment. I think that unions need to fight for more flexible work arrangements. This sort of myth about flexibility, is something that, is really part of this capitalist ideology of this is why you need these casual and whatever sorts of work part-time because you need flexibility to fit in with your family and look after your kids and all that stuff. Well, that's I think, the majority of people would prefer permanent, work that they can rely on. And you can actually achieve that flexibility with permanent work. I think we actually do have some fairly good conditions in the WA public sector. We do have flexible work arrangements that people can access, flexi time and different forms of leave to accommodate their family life, but also provide them with that security. The issue, though, is that not a lot of people access these for various reasons. Some people think that if they access these arrangements, it will kind of set them back in terms of their career and it doesn't look good. Some people don't access these forms of leave and certain arrangements because their workload issues are simply too high to allow them to take that time as well. So I think there's a few issues there as well. Just because we win something, that's not it. We've got to make sure that that people are able to use these things to better themselves and their careers and their lives. I think unions need to also, getting back to that issue of enforce provisions that they might have in their awards and agreements about certain situations where contracts can be used, for instance. And as I said, I do think we have been a little bit slack in terms of really enforcing that stuff. And as a movement, I think we could be campaigning for legislative protections, that really do regulate when those things can be used and make sure that there is actually a legitimate need for those forms of work to be used, because most of the time there just is no legitimate need. There's no reason why that job can't be a permanent job. And look, I guess the key thing is obviously what we need to do is address the power balance between workers and the bosses. We need to win back power. We need to rebuild the union movement. Make sure people are aware of their rights, and importantly, make sure people stand up for their rights. I think we also need to challenge this ideology about flexibility. Like that old kind of thing that capitalist class kind of wheel out, and they've sort of really, it's kind of dominated public debate, their view of flexibility. So we need to be out there sort of promoting what real good work can look like. It can be fulfilling, and I think, importantly though, it's about power, and it's about workers winning back power to have control over their own lives. So I guess, look, I'll leave it there, and I've gone on too long, but I hope we can talk more in discussion. Yeah. So.